All right. Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Linda Hofshire. I am at the Colorado State Library and am very excited to be presenting this webinar today that is Libraries Build Pathways to Wellbeing. This is part of the Ripple webinar series. If you are not familiar with Ripple, Ripple is an acronym for the Research Institute for Public Libraries, and Ripple is an initiative that provides in-person and virtual training about public library data and evaluation. And you can learn more about us at our website that's listed on the screen. You can see ripl.lrs.org. But I want to jump right into our topic today because I know that Margot has a lot to share. And so I am going to just give her a quick introduction. If my slides will turn. Oh, and actually, before I do that, let me just mention a couple things about Zoom. And everybody is probably, Zoom experts by now, but just in case, I wanted to point out that at the bottom of your screen, if you hover over that area, you should see the black bar that you're seeing on the screen on the bottom of my screen right now, which says, has a couple different options. Make sure that you click on chat so that your chat window appears. That will allow you to communicate at any point during the webinar. And then the other thing I want to point out is that once your chat box comes up, make sure that if you do type anything in there, that you direct it to everyone. You can see that little pull down menu, and it has a few different options, but by directing it to everybody, that means that everybody will share your messages or will see your messages. And we look forward to having you share whenever you would like. During chat today, please feel free to enter your comments and questions. And we look forward to having a lively discussion as part of this. And so I'm going to ask everybody now, if you want to go ahead and mute your video, so to speak, and so that we'll just focus on Margot's session for now. And then if you want, when we come back at the end for some questions and discussion, feel free to share your video again. And so without further ado, I want to introduce our awesome speaker. So we are so happy to have Margot Gastina with us today. She is the Special Projects Librarian at the Southern Tier Library System. And Margot, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks for inviting me to share stuff about our project, and also thanks all of you for dropping in. It's pretty exciting to have this many people interested not only in social well-being, but also interested in how we learn from communities, which is going to be a portion of the talk. My name is Margot, and in my position, I have the privilege of time to answer big questions with super messy and complicated answers. And during the talk today, if you have questions, as moving through, feel free to interrupt me if they're clarifying questions, like you want to know more about a particular topic and you think it would benefit the group to spend some time there. Linda's going to monitor the chat and she'll stop me and let me know that it's time for somebody else to talk, or she'll ask your question for you. I can't pay attention to chat, so definitely use everyone and don't direct chat me because I will never see it. And then if you have a curiosity that's specific to your community and what happens there, and how these ideas might pertain to you in your situation, feel free to email me. My contact information is here. It's also on the last slide. Oh, this was our first test. Yes. Okay. So Linda's got a poll for you. And the question is, do you yourself consider consider yourself a researcher. I'm going to give you guys a second to vote. We've got like almost 70%. Oh, this is like very exciting. It's like horse races or something. Come on, the final 20. So most of you, given 87% voting rates, most of you, 60%, consider yourselves researchers, which is pretty exciting. When I'm talking to library practitioners, sometimes the identity of researcher becomes a barrier to them doing research. So I'm excited to see these numbers. Thank you. And then next, have you in the past coded qualitative data or developed a code book for coding qualitative data before? All right, we're almost there. All right, so these numbers aren't exactly as strong as they were before. Some of the language might be getting in your way. Some of it might be understanding what I mean by coding qualitative data, which we're gonna kind of get back into later. But 25% of you said yes. So be kind to me when I describe it. And if you've got something to say to clarify or enrich what I've described as coding, please feel free to put it in the chat. Linda will interrupt me. That will be good for the group. Statisticians and economists are fond of quoting this quote that's all models are wrong, but some are useful. The part of the reason to consider this idea, or like hold it in your head as we talk through what I'm going to share today, is that we made a project, we were pretty successful. We're still doing it, but nothing that I share with you is going to be perfect. And what we understand to be true about communities will never get at the full nuance and complexity of what we see there. So I don't want you, three things. I'm really into you calling shenanigans if I say something that doesn't resonate with you, but also remember that your experience may not be the experience of everyone else, but where there's a big gap, that's a good gap for inquiry, and we should talk about it. This is what I'd like to talk about today. I want to talk about social well-being in general. I want to talk about our specific project and how we designed it, the research methods that we used. There's a portion of this that's just straight up opinion, which is what I think matters about research when it comes to public libraries and communities, and the ethics that surround that. Analyzing qualitative data, I'm just gonna talk through our process. Again, for those of you who have divergent practices that you think would be useful to the group, please bring them up. And then turning findings into practice. So what we've been calling our evidence-based no rules tools. Here's an important part of this right now. If you don't see something that you know you wanted me to cover in this talk, feel free to put it in the chat box. I make really detailed notes and scripts for my presentations so that people like Linda can put them on the page with the recording, and you'll know all the things I had intended to talk about, so that if our live talk, our live conversation gets conversational, and I don't touch on everything in this list while we're together, you can read about it. All right. So let's talk about social well-being, and let's quickly get past some unfamiliar language about social well-being. Once we're like not caught up in what specifically that means, conceptually, social well-being is really viscerally understandable. It's, as Scott, Rowe, and Pollock, oh, that brings up another thing. Anytime I talk about a citation, I'm not putting it in the chat box, but the end of the slide deck has all of the references, and they're nice and big in order of appearance in the PDF that Linda will put on the website. So don't sweat them right now, just kind of roll with me. So as Scott, Rowe, and Pollock put it, social well-being is a measure of what makes the good life in a community. And although economists and sociologists, planners, and policymakers have been building and testing frameworks and indices for measuring what defines social well-being accurately, for the individual as well as for the community, what we think of as the good life is going to be nuanced and varied. Our individual definitions will be full of elements from our personal stories, which both enrich and for sure complicate measurement when you're an outside force. So I'm from New York, upstate New York, not the city, or any of the cities. I just realized I did a New York City centric thing. So once during a statewide conversation amongst the 23 public library system directors in that state about what defines a public library from a regulatory standpoint, really, my colleague and partner, Eli Ganay, said, not a single community I serve would be better off without its public library. I'm skeptical of bold claims, so I asked, like, is that true? And how can we know if it's true? And then in 2017, IMLS released their first Community Catalyst report. It's written by Michael Norton and Emily Dowdle of the Reinvestment Fund. And it really revolutionized my thinking on what's possible in the world of public library service assessment, which is, I think, a world that many of you live in. What if we could capture, measure, and maybe even prove that having a local library, a local public library, improves our lives? The table on the slide lists out 10 social well-being dimensions on the right, which were refined by Stern, Goldstein, and Haag in their paper, Culture as a Dimension of Social Well-Being. And then Michael Norton and Emily Dowdle did this really impressive and super useful to me thing, which is they took their work and they developed this list of content areas on the left. So by which I mean areas where museums and public libraries often operate in, like the services that we often provide that they hypothesized would support these social well-being dimensions. There are two things about this that I find particularly useful to us. First, here is this bridge between outcomes we want and the kinds of work we're already engaged in. What this might indicate to us is that doing social well-being work, so doing work that results in social well-being outcomes, might not be a new kind of work, but instead a shift in the practices that we already perform. And next, I notice that at least part of the thinking and work of creating this bridge is work that librarians often do. It's categorizing, it's theming, it's finding the common and disparate threads between items and subjects. And the work we should become more familiar with as we learn to do action research in our own communities. Most of you picture yourselves as researchers, but not a ton of you saw yourselves as people who code or do qualitative analysis. So we'll come back to this and what practices here are common to us. We use this list of 4 areas of work to help frame our understanding of service and social well-being, lifelong learning and cultural engagement, economic development, physical and mental health, and placemaking in the environment in our study as well. Oh, P.S. I keep paper notes. So we asked, are public libraries a component of social well-being in resource-poor geographies? And if so, what practices do they employ? Usually when I present on our project, a lot of people want to know how we define each and every component of that slide. Because I've given that talk kind of a lot, And because you have myriad resources to find that out through our project page, I'm kind of going to gloss over those definitions for now and focus on the meat and topic of our conversation. So there already exists, come back with me to 2017. There already exists this excellent research into the relationship between social well-being and museums and public libraries. The Reinvestment Fund with other partners are actually currently working through a study of how this really works in detail across the nation. So they're doing this work right now also, similar to our project, but they're looking at all cultural heritage institutions that are public across the nation, across different kinds of geographies. So urban, suburban, and rural fringe, which is like that rural community that's right outside of a suburb, right outside of a city. What we find, and their work is dynamic and innovative and impactful, but what we find in conversations about innovative and dynamic and impactful library service, rural libraries are typically left out. The perspective is generally that rural libraries have a lot to learn from urban libraries, and that the goal should be that rural libraries work hard to replicate what urban libraries are able to achieve. We found something quite different, but I'll start with, we knew we wanted to focus in on rural remote libraries because they're usually not in the discussion of service. So here's our question. And we also did something in this question asking, which reinforced the perspective that rural communities are simply a place of lack, so a place of absence, rather than a place of strength. So were I to write this again, I might change it. Our project outcomes. So for those of you who have engaged in assessment thinking before, you know that just asking the question isn't enough to guide design and implementation. It's a great first step, right? And it helps set our compass settings, right? But out of a 3-year national research and resources development project, we knew we needed clearer outcomes and guides. So we also wrote a purpose statement. We want to celebrate, respectfully translate the work of our rural library partners in order to assist other libraries that want to improve social well-being outcomes. They each bring unique strengths and value in the face of unique challenges. We really believe that, and we've looked at this purpose over and over throughout the phases of our project, and this becomes finer and clearer, but it's always the same. This was also developed with Eli Ganay, the State Librarian of New Mexico, and Hope Decker, the Member Services Liaison of the Pioneer Library System. We formed the initial project team, and we're all still at it, man. Here's the other sort of maxim that we use when we're looking at our research, our project design, but also the products that came out of our findings. And that's that each person is an end and not a means. It's a thinking and practice thread that runs through my work. And this research has really helped me clarify it, that respect for the human dignity and value of each individual is proved across all areas of work, not just in our stated goals or intended outcomes. As this webinar is designed for practitioner researchers like Hope, Eli, and I'm going to take a minute to explain and unpack this a little and what I mean by that statement. And first in terms of research, but then we're going to talk about how we pull this this value and this principle into how we're translating research into practice. Okay. First, valuing individual subjects in data gathering design is done through how we approach consent, interviews, weighting of quantitative against qualitative data. We follow an engaged consent process. Really valuable in shaping our methodology and our ethics approach was the MIT X class called Lean Research Skills for Conducting Interviews. So for those of you who are working in an academic institution, I don't know, I guess I should have asked the split of you between academic institutions and actual public libraries. But if you're not working in a public library, you don't have access to an institutional review board. We also did not have access to an institutional review board, but that doesn't mean that we can't practice ethics when it comes to how we work with people and with communities. So if any of you don't have that access and are interested in supplementing your Ripple experience with a free short course in qualitative research, I'd highly recommend it. And yes, of course, it's in the references. Remember that our research purpose, that we create useful resources, and our principle that each individual has value. That means that our consent process gave over control of how interview content would be used to the interview subject in some really direct and engaged ways. So we gave them a lot of opportunities to put the brakes on what we were doing, and then to have very nuanced control over how we used the interview when it was done. We asked permission to record at the end of the interview. When subjects signed a form, they got to choose which level of anonymity they preferred, and they got our card with their interview number, so they would have full freedom to change their consent if they wished in the future. This is our tiny itty bitty recorder and all of our stuff that we took with us when we went. What's useful to the interview subject about participating in this, what is useful to the interview subject about participating in this interview or focus group? For most projects, the primary beneficiary of research is the researcher themselves. We have goals and outcomes that are often really lofty, and we desire to make these really great changes based on the research that we're doing, and that is awesome. And I support you, and I support us too. But being realistic about what those outcomes will mean on an individual basis, and what having a successful research portfolio might mean for you, especially if you're working in an academic institution, and putting those in balance and appreciating the tension between those things, I think is the difference between an ethical research project and an extractive one. As people who love libraries, who serve people, who find libraries valuable enough that they use them, we sometimes take for granted that anything we perceive to be beneficial to the library would be automatically beneficial to the community. But those assumptions don't typically hold if we think about non-users in our community. Our average interview length was about 18 minutes and around 60 minutes for groups. Most subjects left saying things like, "We're done already," or "That was fun," which is pretty great to hear. We're aware that the communities that we visited, especially isolated rural communities, but also dense urban ones, you could probably find this history in most communities in the United States, has this deep history of extraction. One community required that community-wide anonymity. So anyone who spoke to us, we couldn't actually name the location that that interview came from, which complicated how we did coding. We didn't code those interviews. They're not included in our count of 114. But they taught us something, and that was that there was an endless succession to their community. The reason they chose that is that there's this endless succession of expert outsiders who would tell residents what they should do, and then could move on. They could go elsewhere when things didn't work out as planned. And we see that kind of behavior among researchers in rural communities and among rural libraries. And so the responsibility falls to the researcher to design for respect rather than extraction. And as a researcher and the primary beneficiary of the project, it's important that you say, how will I make sure this product, or whatever the outcome is, has direct positive influence on the lives of the people I interviewed? And how do I make sure that my findings get to them? So don't you study rural communities and then publish in a place that no rural library could read, or any rural community. I'm looking at you, Rural Studies Journal. Further, those potential audiences deserve your consideration. Those potential audiences that deserve your consideration are interview subjects. So it also means that maybe some of your findings look different so that you can reflect what you heard back to the community. One of the biggest questions that we got from interview subjects was, what happens next, and when will I find out if this matters? I'll not make an argument here for either quantitative or qualitative data or methods being better. I see value in collecting the best data for the questions you wish to answer in the most respectful way possible. A part of that, though, will be trusting qualitative data when it runs counter to the quantitative data that you have, and using that disagreement as a fruitful place of inquiry. I'm returning to this quote for a reason, I promise. After interviewing over 200 community residents in rural remote locations across the US and coding the resulting 114 recorded and transcribed interviews, we found that any treatment of social well-being that does not, as Martha Nussbaum posits, agree with Immanuel Kant on this point, that each person is an end and not a means, will not be complete. So aggregating and counting our information is like, well, it's what we do. And it's the way to operationalize indicators that we're seeing and that we want to measure and that we want to value. But overall counts and in averages often make invisible those whose experiences are not in line with the average. It might be said that it's in our outliers and in the margins that the truth of library service can often be seen. How we operate and how we serve communities that at this point might not be engaged with the library, or whose experience might not align with the aggregate understanding of social well-being indicators in your town. So our findings indicate that yes, public libraries are a component of social well-being in resource-poor geographies. Done. Okay, now everybody can go home. Just kidding. We can say this with a great deal of confidence for a few reasons. Coding community resident descriptions of their ideal community and their descriptions of the services they receive through the library and library staff are really well aligned. We infer from this that the local public library facilitates social well-being as described by residents. I'm just gonna take 1 second to ask if anyone has questions about this or anything that I've said before. Or you just want me to sally forth? Okay, I'm just gonna use my little mouse to go like this. I don't know if you can see me though. I don't remember how to use a pointer in Zoom. This bottom business down here, these are also averages. By the way, sorry, I just said this thing about averages. I'm telling you, these are averages across all 8 communities. This is contribution. This is infrastructure. This is to be seen and feel known. This is feeling supported, and this is social connection. And you can see how residents view themselves and their town and the ideal life, and how they see the language they use to describe library and director service are pretty well aligned. There's 2 places of giant misalignment, which is knowledge and discovery and nature. So libraries don't really have anything to do with nature and the natural surroundings. If you're living in a remote rural community, it's a pretty big priority for you. This misalignment around knowledge and discovery doesn't mean that people don't view knowledge and discovery as an important feature of their lives. See, this is still knowledge and discovery. It's significant. But proportionally, they really see knowledge and discovery as the library's job. So when they're talking about the library, library service, and the library director and staff, it's the thing that comes up the most. So proportionally speaking, it gets this really big chunk of the pie. All right, we also looked at this from a data perspective, and this funny bar graph deserves some explaining and also some consideration on your part. I'd love to, even though we probably won't have time today during our talk here, I'd love to chat with you about it in the future. Let's talk about this. So quantitative analysis at the zip code level is awesome if what you're looking at is rural communities. So communities with populations under 5,000, really ideally populations under 2,500. And that's because the zip code encompasses the whole town, maybe even a little more, whereas a census block is even bigger. It might encompass 3 or 4 communities, depending on how isolated or how low density the rural community is. It can go up to like 6 communities. A school district, same deal. Can have a lot of consolidated rural school districts have up to 10 communities in them. So it's not a useful boundary if what we're looking at is rural remote communities. But when looking at measures between rural remote communities and cities or suburban communities, it gets really hard to compare across those geographies because zip codes do other things in places where the population is denser. It's the reason why when people are doing measurement, they often go out to the county level because it works everywhere. We wanted to be able to really look at this tiny changes between these places. You'll notice that there's not a significant difference between adult educational attainment of adults 18 years old or older in a particular, residing in a particular zip code who have a high school diploma or more. That's what adult educational attainment means in this slide. Yes is a zip code with a library in it, a library facility. No is a zip code without a library facility in it. Libraries are holding strong at a few percentage points bigger than communities without libraries. But you'll notice that that difference is slightly bigger in tinier towns. So the tinier the town, the easier it is to see the difference. When I first saw this a couple years ago, I called Michael Norton. Thanks, Michael, if you're on the call. And he mentioned to me that one of the things that's complicating how I view this is that this is a snapshot in time, and that it might be more useful, especially when we're talking about rural communities that have a history of economic decline as well as population decline, that we look at longitudinal studies over time to see if there's a difference between mirrored communities, communities that are pretty much in the same place in 1950, but one has a library and one doesn't. And then look at how they change over time across multiple publicly available data points that help us understand social well-being. So there's about a dozen or so Census Bureau collected data points that we used in our study. But the Census Bureau has changed how we access data. So it's going to be a little while before we can do any kind of longitudinal study. If anybody's on from the Census Bureau, give me a hand. All right. This is a really long quote. So we know that there's some sort of capturable quantitative data difference between towns with libraries and towns without them in rural communities. We know that when coding the priorities of community members and describing their ideal community and library service that they receive either by the library themselves, the library as an institution, or the director themselves, that there's a lot of alignment. But we also know from verbatim stories from community members, what they describe about their community life is fully intertwined with the library. So here's a quote from Marshfield, Vermont. He says, I know when I first came here 40 years ago, the playground equipment, for example, was a broken swing set and a tractor tire set in the ground. There seemed to be very little for children in this area compared to now. And this is to the point of the importance of a library. We have story hours for the kids, and the kids can get together with other kids, which was very difficult when I first moved here. And the playground was built by volunteer labor by the parents of kids who come to this story hour. The community has been catalyzed by the library in many ways. I didn't give this guy like pointers on how to talk about the library in the community. P.S. We didn't do that. But what we can see is that when they describe how the library operates in the town and what happens there, they're describing the library as an anchor institution, a catalyst of collective action, and a facilitator of individual access to both the wider world and the community itself. And all of these ideas pretty much came up in the IMLS Community Catalysts Initiative study that Norton and Dowdell report that I mentioned earlier. What we found is that there's consistent evidence that they're right in every town we visited. And so a big part of our work is, if all this stuff is true, what practices do libraries employ? So we can see with the entire, plurality of data that the practices they employ are context specific. So those things that influence well-being, we can see across communities, but they're not really specific things they do. It's how they do them. And so what informs our research-based products that move us toward practices that aid social well-being outcomes tends toward how a library director or a library interacts with the mechanisms that already exist in a community. I want to pause here and ask, we're already at like 11:38, and I just want to ask, I'm going to start going over how we coded and what we found. But if you all have an opinion about whether you'd like me to fast forward through this section and get to the tools that we're creating, put it in chat and Linda will interrupt me. Okay, so qualitative data can be analyzed in a variety of ways. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about how we did it, which is, when I say qualitative data, I'm talking about information we gathered through interviews and surveys, and we used the subject's own words. And when I say code, I'm generally talking about a text-based tag. One applies to excerpts from the subject's actual words. So with our 114 community interviews, as we coded our data, we had a resulting 2,662 excerpts or quotes to which we applied those codes. This is an actual quote right here from Jerry Ann Davis in West Virginia. It's her answer to what her ideal community would feel like. And on the right, there are these 3 sets of tags we use to describe what's happening in their interview. We used a framework first to code all the data. And that came directly from Norton and Dowdell's categories or content areas of work. So that was economic development, lifelong learning and cultural engagement, physical and mental health, and placemaking in the environment. So all of that data got tagged with those, and we knew that we were going to use those, so we made sure we asked questions, sort of fit some of those buckets. After we interviewed them, we said, okay, most of what we've got falls into these sort of 5 topic areas. We want to know, people are talking about what they want and what they don't want. They're talking about the past and current community conditions. Partly, we had questions in our interview set that tried to get at that topic, past and current community conditions and how they changed, in hopes that we would have qualitative data that we could tie back to Mike Norton's idea that maybe a library's existence isn't that in a snapshot of time, it makes a community better off, but maybe it staves off the bad that happens to communities without any community anchor available to them. And then we've got codes. So those two sets that I talk about above, we established them before we started coding. But this last set, codes, those we developed through a process called emergent coding. So we all interviewed people. We then all cleaned the transcripts from all those interviews. So everybody heard all the interviews, even if they weren't present in that location. And we said, okay, these are the themes we hear. And we got together over a series of meetings to develop these words that became the themes of our codes. So,
and Margot,
yeah,
I'm going to break in really quick to say that we do have a few people who are definitely interested in tools. So just to make sure that we balance this with tool talk as well.
You got it. You got it. You got it. So I'll only say kind of like one more thing about this. For those of you who say that you've never coded before, if you have done, if you've facilitated focus groups or any group discussion where in real time you're theming or categorizing or distilling what the group is saying, that's pretty much the process of emergent coding. It's just a difference in data size and sets. All right, so we're gonna like boom through here. If we want to go back to this later, let me know. We'll talk about it. It's cool. Oh, I'm gonna pause here though, because this is the juicy business that helped us get to the practices that we would want to develop. So I'm gonna say like 3 different things about this slide. When rural residents describe directors and staff, this is sort of the coding breakdown on the right, and on the left, those are the categories of work that most of the work seem to fall into. I want to point out that the reason on the left, a giant part of the pie is lifelong learning and cultural engagement, is in part because we defined that according to how Norton and Dowdell defined it, which is that it includes the social well-being dimension, social connection. And of all of the things that we found, social connection was the driver. It was the driver of connection from the individual to the library. It was the thing that created a sense of belonging in town. And everything in this graph that's giant, other than infrastructure, is contribution, knowledge and discovery, social connection, shared identity, all that stuff. All of it falls, when we use Norton and Dowdell's framework, it all kind of fell under lifelong learning and cultural engagement. It doesn't mean that library directors and libraries aren't impacting on these other areas of social well-being. It's just how these two kinds of sets interact. Yes, is there anybody have a question about that? No? Okay. When we talk about alignment, we also saw some really interesting things that allowed us to talk to the directors of different communities where there was tight alignment between the library and the community on certain elements that the community itself wanted. So where these bars are clustered around the center, there's closer alignment between priorities. Where they are really divergent are, it's a lot like that stacked bar graph I showed you before, but this is divided out by community. And you'll notice that there's a decent amount of variation. It's in part because no community does all the things well. Also, no community did nothing. So there wasn't a place that we visited where we were like, God, this library really stinks. None of that is true. What we found was that the way libraries do their work, like social connection, making people feel seen and heard, facilitating individuals' power and then collective decision-making and collective power, those things happened in very different ways, depending on local circumstances and local context and local culture. Like, what would make sense? Are you from a community that really respects regulation and rules? Are you from a community that really respects individual independence? Then how those things are structured is going to look really different, and reinforces something that's a bias of mine, but I think we found it, and in conversations with our local library partners, they reiterated it, which is there's no such thing as a best practice in this. So we had advisors. These are our local library partners. So these are the folks that helped inform how we viewed what would happen next and how we translate our findings into practice. This set of folks, I'm gonna just name names here so you know who I'm talking about. Rick Steyer from Idaho, Pam Brown from Mississippi, Hope Decker, who's also on the research team, is leading this effort, Emily Brownell from Wisconsin, Susan Green from Vermont, Kate Cozier from New York, Jerry Ann Davis from West Virginia, and Chelsea Price from Iowa are take all of those findings and think them through. By which I mean, these super busy people have read the research, they've read our coded field data, they've read specifically reports about their own communities and provided guidance and feedback on how those things should be shaped. And they helped us understand and refine our sense of what it means to have social well-being outcomes that are context specific. So you might see that this has like a bunch of squiggly wiggly lines. We found 3 predominant pathways in communities that libraries are acting on or supporting or facilitating to different levels, and that they lead to positive social well-being outcomes, and that they build the kind of social connections and networks of mutualism that create a more resilient and responsive community to change, and help reinforce what we might call community self-insurance, or the way in which we help one another. We heard from people across the country, well, 98% of residents that we interviewed said that they're currently living in their ideal community. That, coupled with their own language and coupled with research on attachment to place, we call that belonging and home. And it seems to be the thing, people feeling that seems to be the thing that allows them to have, to make moves toward individual and collective action, and to have networks of mutualism that allow them to be healthier. And that, it isn't always borne out in social well-being indicator data. Again, it's actually sometimes what we saw was a really healthy socially connected community that might, when it comes to aggregating social well-being indicator data from the feds, there might be a real disconnect there. And if you ever want to talk about it, we can. This is how our creation team views how pathways and social well-being outcomes work together, and our codes. The reason I show this to you is to reinforce that a lot of this is squiggly and wiggly. It's dynamically reciprocal, and all tools that we create have to bend themselves to this reality that whatever we offer to you as something useful isn't a set of rules. And it isn't that we can say there's this one-to-one relationship. If you just do this program, you'll get this social well-being outcome. Instead, what we can say to you is, that repeat action over time toward a goal helps build outcomes toward that goal. And so repeat actions towards social connection through things like making every resident feel seen and known, providing them pathways of contribution, because we found that contribution and belonging have a reciprocal relationship, and belonging doesn't often, attachment doesn't often occur. We didn't hear it where a person wasn't also contributing to their community. That act of contribution helped them feel they belonged as a community member. So the evidence-based no rules tools are not prescriptions, period. Nearly half of the library outlets in the US are considered rural. We have over, depending on how we shape the boundaries, we have over like 7,000 library directors in the United States. So we've produced, as a creation team, they've produced around 20 tools, or will have by the end of our tool creation period. Right now, we're attempting to maximize difference. The hope is that if we maximize the diversity of approach and the plurality of ideas and topics that we could develop a tool on, that we would get a chorus of rural library voices where others would find some resonance. Which brings me to trust. What I'm about to say is both like intuitive to recognize as true and also pretty radical to implement, and I encourage you as researchers to try it out. We trust the infinite complexity of communities and the individuals who reside in them. We also hold ourselves accountable to that maxim that our purpose is to uncover the practices that are working so that you can understand how to employ something that is specific to your context and your community. This manifests in the creation team as trusting that they'll create something that comes from their personal passion and also that is specifically of interest to them, and building across a large group of people those tools. We might have something that resonates for you in your community. Our last date to test the tools and to give us evaluative feedback on whether or not they're useful to you and whether or not they resonate with you or are relevant to you, or actually if they feel evidence-based, or if they feel like we're saying, here's a best practice that you should do too. That's not our intention. So that's part of the evaluation process, and they all exist and are ready for you to try them out. If you do it, you'll probably get a $25 thank you gift card. I'm gonna stop and leave it for questions, and then Linda will wrap us out. What have you been asking me?
Thanks so much, Margot. I ask if you could maybe give a quick description of a tool, just so that people could get a sense of what that looks like.
Ooh, I'm gonna, sorry guys, this is gonna look messy for just 1 second, but we'll get there. So here's our beta tools page. They look like this right now. After our call, I'll finish up a tool that comes from Susan Green in Marshfield, Vermont. Let's pick nature. When we say tools, when we asked our creation team, what do you think of when you think of tools and what would be useful to you? We heard a variety of answers. Some of them were things like personality quizzes, and some of them were like reflection exercises. Again, the style of how you get to awareness of your community's context and action toward a specific outcome is pretty personal. So some people like assessments, some people like reflection work, some people like quizzes with tips. This is what a typical tool page looks like. There's a note from the tool's author and an introduction to the research that they wrote, or an introduction to the tool that they wrote. It usually makes a connection between the qualitative data that we gathered and their perspective on it. And then for Emily's tool, Nature Going Beyond the Walls of the Library, she used a quote from a resident in West Virginia who just talked about how rich they feel and why living in a rural community allows them to be an effective business owner, actually, an effective planner and business owner. And so there's an introduction. Emily's tool attempts to take people from reflection about what they have available to them, and then asking them probing questions to get them to plan out future action that they can take that would make these assets more readily available to community members. Again, not a what you should do is a story walk, but instead, let's think about what you have available to you within your community context that makes sense. What kind of programs already exist, and how do you fit there? And with this specific outcome, which is access to nature, including why are there some people in your town that might not access some of these resources and assets? There's typically quotes throughout the tool that come from any of our research communities that help give you some example or context for what's going on in the tool and what you might want to think about. And then many of the tools try to move you toward an action. Some of the actions might just be internal, like, oh, maybe I should look for more support, or now I'm aware of this resource that's available to me from my own community. It's something kind of like asset mapping married to a lot of the tools, not all of them. Asset mapping on a specific topic married to action planning. A lot of it is trying to build the bridge between how you think about the assets in your town and what you're capable of facilitating. Because we don't believe that libraries acting all on their own is like superhero institutions is sustainable, and we didn't see it operating. Where we saw communities that were healthiest and really thriving, and we heard that thriving from community members. Oh, you've been seeing the tool, right? I just realized I don't know which screen I'm sharing.
Yes.
Anyway, where we see thriving communities mixed with thriving libraries, the library is this porous institution that is facilitating individuals and organizations in their connection to one another and catalyzing action in between them. And sometimes that means reaching out to specific individuals to help them see their powerful contributions that they could give to the library or give to the community. And without the library's intervention, that being able to see your contribution path or how you belong to that community is sometimes invisible, especially if you happen to be a member of a marginalized community historically.
And so, Margot, just because of time, I'm going to stop you now, but I wanted to quickly mention that there are a couple of really interesting questions that were shared in chat that we did not have time to get to, and I'm going to share them with you offline. And I'm hoping that if you could write up an answer, we will include that on our webpage where we have the other information, including where this recording will be posted and all the other resources within the next 24 hours. So we will provide all of that over there. I want to thank you so much for sharing this amazing project with us. I think that we could continue a rich discussion, and hopefully we can have a chance to do that offline. And I will ask everyone as you leave, if you have a moment, just take a click on the link that I just put in chat. That leads to a really short evaluation, and that just helps us to know what you might want next in this webinar series. So we really appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. Thank you again, Margot, for your great session, and have a great afternoon, everybody. Goodbye.